Hi, very good afternoon, everyone, and good morning, Narayanan. I can see you logged in as well. So very good afternoon, good morning, each one of you. My name is Rakesh Sinha. Pleasure to have you all joining this session today. It's a day two of the third Finance Leadership E-Summit. As we spoke yesterday, Shared Services Forum continuing with its mission of bringing the community together, bringing the knowledge dissemination as a mission, and really progressing further on some of that. This year, thought of doing an e-summit as compared to what we have been doing a physical summit. I think COVID is also one of the reasons for it. Yesterday, we had some interesting discussion sessions in terms of looking at global business services, how the global business services are looking at navigating through this pandemic, looking at the short-term cost takeouts, looking at what should be the fine balance they need to have with the long-term transformation plans. We had a very interesting session even from the India Shared Services team point of view, which looked at sharing how they are not remaining a cost center. Now they are moving to become a value center, and the kind of impactful data points some of the panelists shared was really very impressive. So I think building on that, today we have a couple of sessions in the first session now, and I have been joined by a very eminent leaders. Sanjay Gupta, I know many of you have been knowing him very well. He is the Chief Architect for Shared Services Forum. And obviously, he's a chief editor for a lot of content we put together from a shared services point of view, bringing an immense experience of this industry. I have two other great panelists with me, joining from ACCA, Narayanan Vaidyanathan. Narayanan has joined from London, and he obviously leads the insight, the business insights part of it with ACCA, bringing a lot of industry side view and the same point of side, if I can use the word, the thought leadership on the table. And his exemplary career profile has been also circulated with all the attendees on this call just now. We also have Rahul Puri. Rahul leads the employer relations in India, and he is an instrumental conduit with Industry Connect and ACCA, if I can say from an India point of view. And even SSF and ACCA have a very strong connect on some of the areas. Both of us really bring the philosophy of knowledge dissemination and the philosophy of bringing what is the current trend at the same point of time, what's next. Looking at some innovative ideas, giving the directions to the organizations and the leaders from the what we call sometimes future of work or future of function or future of area and so on and so forth. And building on that, today we are going to have in the next about 45 minutes or so, or two sessions, if I can say the part of it. One story, which is coming very interestingly from a finance or a future of finance globally, based on a recent survey, which was done by ACCA along with PwC. And I think that is what I would be requesting Narayanan and Rahul to take us through and provide some insights of the future of finance. And developing it further in the next bucket of the conversation, we'll also have Sanjay and myself adding to it, talking about the future of finance professionals in finance shared services, how you need to remain relevant with a lot of these changes happening, in particular with the unprecedented time and the crisis, how you remain become relevant and not just relevant, also become very critical and important contributor is the story which we'll have in the second bucket of the conversation. So just not wasting any time further, I will hand it over to Narayanan, you and Rahul to take us through some of the insights from your finance reimagined. So over to Narayanan and Rahul.
Thank you, Rakesh. As always, very kind of you for inviting us to this forum and session. It's always a pleasure to be able to come and share more around some of our research that we do, which is in the greater good of not just the industry, but also for all the finance leaders on the call and the rest of the team which is there on the call. So as you rightly said, what we're seeing is a lot of change, and the way the businesses are evolving is quite dynamic, not just in terms of COVID, but also in terms of technology as to the role that it is currently playing. So over the next 10 to 15 minutes, what Narayanan and I would like to do is share with you some of the insights from our report, and we want to be able to help everyone on the call look at a different perspective, a perspective of how finance as an organization or as a function is probably focusing on an evolution that is taking place, not just because of technology, but areas of expectations which are coming out. For example, insights and performance are domains which are definitely which go hand in hand for finance. But when it comes to customer centricity, it requires a lot of agility. It demands a lot of cross-functional collaboration, and that is where the element of strategy, collaboration, key stakeholder management come into picture. So on that note, I'd just like to invite Narayanan, and what we are going to do is just have a quick 10-minute conversation where we would like to share some of our insights from our current report that has recently been released. So Narayanan, I wanted to ask you, given the context that we've now set, that there has been a lot of talk about how the finance function needs to go about its core reporting role and also deliver insights. So why is there so much of emphasis on this aspect, and why do insights matter as much as they do?
Sure. Thank you, Rahul, and thank you, Rakesh, as well, for your introductory comments. And it's a pleasure to be here with you and to be connecting with Sanjay. So to your question, Rahul, I suppose there are a couple of things to bear in mind. The first is that the context for my comments is the report that was earlier referred to that ACCA recently completed with PwC, and we were delighted to also work with SSF in that process. I think to your question about where we see the insights agenda coming from, one very clear trend is speed. So there's a lot of things that are happening at pace, and a lot of that pace, as you point out, is technology driven. So that means that you need to understand what is going on, and you need to refresh your understanding of what is going on also much more quickly. And if you have a structured approach to an insights agenda, it makes it more likely that you will be able to do that. The report, for example, references this quote from Peter Drucker, which talks about using essentially yesterday's logic to solve tomorrow's problems, if I can paraphrase it a little bit. And I think that is the risk here, and that is why the role of insight is so fundamental. I think the other thing which is also true is that the scope of what is expected from the finance function has increased, and there is a wider pool of things that is expected from the finance function. And when I say expected, it's expected from other parts of the business, and it's also expected from society. And there's a whole emphasis around purpose, around organizational purpose, and about being able to act in a way that is responsible, whether it's with respect to the sustainability agenda, whether it's with respect to thinking beyond just profit. There are plenty of examples in the business landscape where the questions have been asked about, whether the profession and whether the finance function can help in really driving that understanding and ethical behavior and working with a purpose-driven way. Now, what all of this means is that there are more things to think about, and your performance is judged across a larger pool of parameters. It's not simply a numerical financial parameter in terms of how much money we made or what the reporting numbers were from the past. And therefore, there is much more also of an emphasis on the drivers of performance for the future. And all of this means that the insight agenda is essentially very, very crucial, because you can't have a view on these matters if you don't have a way of understanding of how to derive insight from your ongoing operations and to drive your future expectations.
Okay, thank you, Narayanan. Moving on, you spoke about the importance of insights. Now, how do we see the role of finance business partnering per se against this backdrop of a greater need for insight coming through?
Yeah, that's a great question, Rahul. And I think again, if I can refer back to the report, I mean, one of the observations that comes through from the report, and one of the things that is explained is kind of a value chain for the components of the insight process. And it sort of starts with data at the front end, using that for reports and for analysis. And then there's another part of it, which is around recommendations, which is around decisions based on those recommendations, and which is around actions, which are based on those decisions which are taken. Now, let me take those two components one by one. So the first component, which is around data, reports, and analysis, is often the traditional understanding of insight and of the traditional understanding of where business partnering can add a lot of value. And that's certainly true. But this is in some ways one half of the story. This insight and this business partnering is only useful if you also are able to bring into play the second half of the story and those components I mentioned in the second half, which is recommendations, decisions based on the recommendation, action based on the decision. And there's a big difference. And this second half is where we see a huge zone of opportunity, as the report calls it. And we see a huge zone of opportunity here because it speaks to your question about the evolution of finance business partnering. The finance function and people in it are very analytical, and they're very good at that kind of work, and they add a lot of value through that analysis. But it's not enough to do the analysis behind a screen. You have to be able to make that analysis count. And you can only make that analysis count if you get people within your organization to buy in to what that analysis is telling us. And that's that zone of opportunity where you need to come out from behind the screen and you need to go out into the wider organization to be able to drive those credible relationships with people in order to, first of all, have clear recommendations, which you can defend, to be able to drive decision making on the back of those recommendations, and to be able to then get the organization to take actions on the back of what all of this decision making is telling us and where it's taken us. That's when you really get the value of the process of creating insight, and you get the value of the business partnering role more generally. There's a global, there's a survey that sits behind the report as well. And one of the interesting data points, and it's a survey that ACCA conducted together with PwC and the Shared Services Forum in India, which had approximately 3,200 responses. And one of the statistics that comes through from that is that 55% of respondents say that they see the finance business partners as a proactive role. So it's not just kind of responding to questions from the business side, but it's also proactively spotting things and taking the conversation forward. But then about only 37% felt that they were really fundamental part of the decision-making process. So at the moment, the picture that's emerging is that they are very respected for their thinking capability, but perhaps not as much in the influence department in terms of being able to really drive the decisions. And that's where we see a big zone of opportunity. Thanks, Rahul.
Thanks, Narayanan. Very interesting. And I think what we always do is start thinking about the future as to, these insights are great. We've already figured out what the finance function is looking at from a reimagination standpoint. But just looking ahead, in your opinion, what does the journey look like for the evolution of the finance function? Because you also spoke about evolution. So what does the evolution look like?
Yeah, again, that's I think a really important question because I think one of the first things that which is worth bearing in mind and which came out very clearly, I think, is this idea of being a proactive finance business partner. It's not just a role or a job role. It's in some senses a vocation. It's a mindset. It's a way of approaching the work that one does. And therefore, it permeates across everything that one does. And it therefore has a role to play in shaping the way one approaches the whole range of activities that one could be taking on. From an organizational point of view, to your question about the evolution of the finance function, that has some implications, because it means that you can't just hire a smart guy from somewhere who says that he's a great business partner with a great CV. This is something which goes beyond just having a smart person. When you look top down from the organizational point of view, I come back to where I started, which was the idea of purpose. And I think when you're setting up a function which is driven by insight, where insight is not just a nice to have, but it's actually driven by insight, the first top-down consideration is organizational purpose. So do you have a clearly defined purpose and what you want to achieve as an organization, what you want to be known for in society and in your industry, for example, and you have a clear sense of who you are. I think that's really important. It sounds a bit abstract, but it's extremely important because it often makes the difference between very transactional work and work that has a consistent theme running through it. It's that sense of a shared purpose. Once you have that, then it becomes much more easy to have an insight strategy where you have a clear view of what is it that you would like to understand through your insight, what is more important and what is less important, and what reporting mechanisms you need within your organization and within your finance function to drive that. And that, I think, is really setting the tone for the culture. So once you have this, then you create a self-fulfilling loop where you get a culture around it, where you have people who understand and get what you're trying to do in that agenda. And that sets the top level. And then you have the next level below that, which is also very important, which is what I was referring to earlier, which was individual skills. You need people with the right skills. You need people who are broader than analytical skills, even though it is the fundamental underpinning. You need people who can be creative. That's really important, because a lot of the business partnering role is about uncertain futures. It's about scenarios. And creativity is really important in that skill set. You can't just do the calculations. You need to have a much more nuanced view about possibilities and what those things could mean for the different directions you could go. And that's where you can add a lot of value. I think there's also a piece there around process. And this is to do with understanding how performance management works, understanding how processes are aligned with your customer agenda. All of this is really important when you're thinking about how much impact an insight-driven process has. Because all too often we see examples where it's death by reporting. There are reports being churned out, report upon report upon report. Nobody knows why they're being produced. They're just produced every week or every month, every quarter. There's stuff that comes out. Everybody looks at it. If they make a bit more of an effort, they'll put a very standard kind of, traffic light, red, amber, green thing. But ultimately, a lot of the value in all of this is commentary as well. Understanding the richness and the color behind just what the metrics are saying. And that's where a lot of the insight also often resides. So having processes in place, business processes that exploit collection of data, both in operational and in financial, because often a big part of the future-looking insight is going to come not just when, historically, what might have been done is to look at the cost center data, because a lot of the financial systems will be based on that. And there's often less of a linkage between that and something like a CRM data, which is the marketing data, and which is often what the customer is thinking, what the future trends and pipelines might be looking like. And so when you start marrying up those two things, you get a very different picture as well. That's just one example, but the point being to think in that way, rather than just doing the calculations, as it were, in terms of the insight process. I think the one other point which I would make is around also thinking about technology very strongly in this whole process. We're in a world where technology and data are absolutely fundamental to the way of thinking about insight. And I think it's almost impossible to be serious about having an insight strategy if you don't have a data strategy. It's almost impossible to do one without the other, I would argue. And therefore, technology and data is at the heart of it. There's this discussion about the digital core and the ability to have a whole ecosystem of apps that link to that core, and which is therefore a cloud-based way of managing a lot of your data. And these are all things that are going to be very stable trends for the future in terms of how insight is managed and delivered. So I think in terms of the evolution of the finance function, I think those are all definitely key aspects. The one last thing, and I'll stop there in the interest of time, is I started by talking about the wider picture, and one of the ways that that's captured is the integrated reporting type lens, where you've got multiple capitals in addition to the financial capital, whether it's the manufactured capital, and that's also evolving with smart factories, whether it's IP and data, intellectual capital, human capital, social capital and purpose and the role in society, as well as natural capital and sustainability. And the evolution will encompass all of these to give a much more holistic view of what the finance function brings to the table.
Thank you, Narayan. I'm sure that there'll be more to come in the later part of the segment, but I'll hand it back to Rakesh to take it forward from here. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Narayana, and thanks, Rahul. Narayana, it was fantastic to hear some of the insights, and I think that is exactly the crux of the whole thing, that how to really link it back to the business. You should not be doing something traditional way of finance, where you are one of the departments or a back office or a corporate functions. How you're really becoming a business partner was one of the broad theme, if I can say. I think in your example of death by reports is something which I can see. Many of us on the panel were having a lot of smiles because we have experienced ourselves many of these. And I'm sure a lot of attendees will be able to relate with it, because two kinds of, if I can say, scenarios. One is we are pushed, some of the people are pushed to just churn reports out of report and report out of report every week, every day, every month. And you're rightly saying red, amber, green, etc., etc. But where the qualitative piece, how it is really enabling the decision, is something which becomes a limitation. And many times those reports are just a transactional input which is provided, but having no commentary or ability to take any decision over that, and that becomes a bit limitation. I think that is a very important point. Just building further on that, and I think as we were talking about, now we want to obviously look at, and I think that many of the principles which you talked about may remain same or similar even in the shared services space as we look at the shared services space. The business partnering, thinking beyond what your areas are, etc., etc. There are many principles which will have a very strong connect and focus in the shared services world as well. Just to give a bit of a color of why we went for this report and how it really started in our mind and how we have visualized it, etc., etc. So this whole report which we have done now in the for the shared services perspective, we call it as a being future relevant and for finance professionals in finance shared services. We reached out to the same sources. Typically, the research are done with the primary research, the secondary research, our own data points, repositories, and as well as looking at some of the available data points and our previous informations as well. I think from the primary perspective, we had a lot of interactions, information exchange. We even looked at our past reports, survey data points, and so on and so forth. And that's where the connect for us is, in our last report when SSF released, we talked about breaking the boundaries and looking from the enterprise services management. We talked more on the holistic point of enterprise services management. And that's a point which we said, you have to look at something in the future, how you're going to create for your organization. It has to be different. And it's if I can say, step further from that point of view to see how we look at more in the shared services and a finance shared services point of view and more for the finance professionals. That's a construct of the report. One of the elements of this report, and I request Sanjay, if you have the slides, if you like to put it up on the screen, will be helpful. And as Sanjay does present the slide, and just check, I think he has the rights for it. Yeah, Sanjay, you have the rights. Very nice. Perfect. So I think as you put up, I think you should put on the slideshow mode, Sanjay. So as you put up the slide, Sanjay, I think one of the areas we were looking at how to just talk about finance, and finance professionals are very connected thing. If you're changing something in the finance as a function, it's about the finance professionals who are finally going to take it ahead and take it to the next level to deliver on it. So as you can see, the caption for us was really looking at how to be future relevant, and future relevant post some context pre-COVID could have been also true, but now with post-COVID, it really becomes, if I can say, must to have than just good to have kind of a situation. Sanjay, if you can flip to the pages, please. See, this is a quick construct of the report from A to E point of view. I think there are 5 sections. The first section looking at the growing landscape. We all are aware of, there are about, just to give you some metrics, $900 billion, to be precise, about $892 billion now is the business services as an industry is all about globally. Out of which about $225 billion is an offshore business services, if I can say. About 194 billion, very interestingly, 194 billion is only business process services, where the finance comes in. The rest all is IT. Sort of $900 billion, about $200 billion is business process services, and under which the finance is part of it. And from a global in-house centers or a captive point of view, it is totally about $50 to $55 billion. But one interesting fact is, even though if you look at the contrast from the IT revenue and the business process services revenue, finance has been, as per the research is very clear, one of the functions which has been the seeding function to start the journey of the shared services. At least 80% of the organizations which has opted or went for a journey of shared services, they have started with finance as a function. And today, about 15% of the total revenue of the business services space is thanks to the finance shared services space. So that's the kind of a landscape we are talking about, which is like really, really big. Now, globally, all the locations, has its own merit and demerit, but obviously India, from a land of offshoring and captive, it has a proven record of it and continues to be the preferred destination. Obviously, there are many more which has been added. Now, some changes may happen in some other locations, more as we go with the next journey of post-COVID, but I think India will continue to be one of the preferred locations as we go ahead. Looking at specifically from the finance at the width and the depth also has changed. Sanjay, I would like to flick to the next page, please, if you don't mind. I think one of the important dimension, I think, is a very interesting statement we heard from one of the leading business services practitioners. He said, 30 years, 40 years back, what engineers did to manufacturing, they just came and took over the manufacturing and created processes, created the industry, and you'll find a lot of business leaders who were all engineers, right, from the manufacturing point of view. But similarly, the finance professionals, the finance leaders have done the same kind of a thing for business services space. You'll find as they've been the pioneers to seed that shared services journey, they never stopped there. They were able to expand it beyond finance to other functions and build the entire industry, which is a multi-function industry now. So that's where they have progressed much beyond just remaining into the finance or the finance shared services. So if you can just flick it to, sorry, you have a control, Sanjay. Sanjay, you want to talk about this slide? It will be good to hear from you maybe on the process change.
Absolutely. So, we keep talking about business partners, etc., and all that, but we believe that business partners, great way to actually become business partners and real partners to the business could well be the shared services route. We also call it business services in a way. And one of the ways we can actually do that is like what Rakesh mentioned, is to expand the scope and to expand the mindset into areas which need not just be restricted to service, but go well beyond that into the business and the main business metrics itself. There are 2 ways we propose this can be done. One is along the functional depth, being functional experts and stuff like that. The other could well be the service chain, which could be impact driven or which could be complexity driven. So I'll just take a minute to explain these 2 chains as we call them. We call one of them as the process chain pyramid. What we mean by process chain pyramid is basically we think that the finance organization can roughly be divided into 4 sections which build upon each other. And the basic section, the basic stage being that of operations, where the more simplistic operations get accounted for and they get captured. For example, data entry kind of work, APAR, REX, all of these are the very basic ones that the function is dependent on. You go next into the accounting function, which is the one where all the accounting per se is done, like bookkeeping or operation, OPEX management, quarterly close, month-end close, etc., where pure accounting takes place. Then you come to the reporting financial management kind of a thing. This is more to do with financial management, say working capital management or asset management, or doing things like compliance, foreign exchange, stuff like that, where the slightly higher intellectual requirement is there for the finance professional to contribute towards. And finally, you have the insights kind of a section, which is analytics. These are the decision enablers Narayanan was also talking about. And here you do things which are, FP&A related, and these are the elements which really contribute into making corporate decisions, business related decisions, etc. If you look at this pyramid from the bottom to the top, we call this moving from business process to business performance. And this is, BP to BP, as we colloquially call it within SSF. It really signifies that you start off with doing processes, but you need to keep in mind the business performance and not a functional performance anymore. So your intellect also moves along with that up the ladder or up the pyramid. Service chain is equally important. On the right of the screen, we can see the service chain. The service chain basically talks about impact, and it therefore talks about the complexity of the process. In pretty much similar way, these are 3 zones which are built upon each other. The basic and the core zone are transactional processing, and the impact on transactional is all about accuracy. It's about timeliness. It's about completeness and stuff like that. So all your basic stuff is about all of that, and you can only move to the next zone if all of that first step, the transactional work, is put into place very, very well. Then you come into the next zone where the impact is higher, and you're talking about the functional role, where you're talking control, compliance, you're talking about risk management. These are the kind of impact these functional excellence and functional roles have on the organization. And finally, the final zone is about value-added services. These value-added services are the real business impacting services, where the complexity is much higher, and what you're actually doing is contributing to the top line or maybe to the bottom line, and balance sheet P&L impacting work, revenue assurance kind of work, real business impact. So basically, we're only talking about the 2 things. One is moving up the process ladder, which is to do with the functional excellence along the way, the functional improvement along the way, and the other is impact related, which is the more complexity thing. And at the end, the result is actually the same, excepting one is to do with process, the other is to do with transformation. So the service chain is what we actually, the mantra we use there is transaction to transformation, because once you actually reach the final zone, it's there where the transformation contribution by the financial experts can actually happen. So here is where we believe that scope can really make a lot of difference, and putting these perspectives into place while you're into a dedicated areas like a business services or a shared service space, especially for finance, can really make a lot of difference because it brings the business from being a back office into being a front office kind of a environment. I'll move on to the next slide. One of the things that we believe, why Rakesh also mentioned that there is a very good affinity between finance and shared services as a business. Please, shared services is, or finance is not the sole proprietorship of business services or shared services. Shared services can happen in service operations, it happens in HR, it happens in IT, it happens in compliance. There's so many kind of environment where shared services take place nowadays, has been for a while. But we still believe that finance as a function has the maximum amount of affinity towards shared services, and the converse is also true. So we believe that if we settle or actually move businesses of finance businesses into shared services, what kind of benefits the shared services centers can have. It's, for instance, the most easy element in the entire business world to move into a kind of a shared service because of its very clinical nature, if I may use that word. It is highly numeric. It embraces change. It embraces digitization the most. It is numeric function. So it can be very easily digitized. It can be very easily understood, analyzed, explained, transported, and everything else can be. It's very simple to do that in comparison to some of the other functions. Because of the same reason, it can bring out a significant amount of operational insights, and therefore can be used to project the future, to bring out what the future can look like, what the environment in the future can be. Again, I'm conscious of the fact that Narayanan mentioned past data not to be used for the future. But nevertheless, past data is the only real back data that you have. And if you pepper it with the known environment and expected projected environment in the future, it can really make a lot of difference to how you foresee the future and how you think businesses can, look at what kind of businesses to look at, etc. Now, I'm not going to go through this list of 7 because then obviously it's a huge list and every one of them can have a long conversation. But I will encourage those of you who are keen to look at the report in completeness and then have a look at what we have to offer here. I'll flip to the next column, which is benefits to the finance function. So the finance professionalism also increases if it gets into an environment where it becomes the focus of the unit. So for instance, if you're talking about a large organization which has varied functional aspects to it, then putting it into a common center creates the sense of standardization and therefore enables a corporate-wide automating the program into the place. And due to all of that, there is an element where you can consolidate your businesses, free up resources, very expensive resources at times, give up fixed costs. Yesterday we were talking about eating away fixed costs, etc. This is a great way of eating away fixed costs because you can let go of a lot of legacy elements and concentrate on a few which you can actually use to expand your business. We've seen in a lot of places a huge amount of OPEX saving merely because we have been able to consolidate a lot of businesses and processes into one common area, one common thought process. We've seen up to 40% finance costs saved, in a very, very short period of time. So the benefit to the finance function to that extent is enormous.
Sanjay, just in the interest of the time and also just to make sure that we are also receiving inputs from some of the attendees today, what I would like to do is I would like to launch a poll and hear some of their inputs on this question. So this is also meant for the panelists, and I request all the panelists to vote for it as well. So this is a poll which is on the screen. And all the audiences and attendees, please, who have logged in live, you have this mode of Q&A available where if you have any questions for any of us, please feel free to post the questions. We'll try to see how much we can respond on this call, but certainly we can even take some of these questions back and get back to you over an email. But feel free to post as many as questions you would like to post on to using a Q&A. So here is the poll. Hope is on the screen. Sanjay, can you see on the screen? So the question is, what in your opinion is the most common barrier for transformation for finance leaders in shared services? So it's about most common barrier, right? The options are silo view, narrow activity focus, getting lost in transactions, adoption of new age technology. I'll just keep this poll open for another 15, 20 seconds. Sanjay, if you don't mind, just click to the next page, please. I think you can see there's a lot of connect to this whole question as well as this page which we are trying to talk about. Is what is the barriers, or what are those barriers for finance leaders who are working in the shared services, and why they are feeling sometimes a little frustrated, anxious, boxed, and so on and so forth. Or they are having, or some are having a great opportunity to grow, as we talked about, like what engineers do to manufacturing. Some of the finance professionals has a lot of opportunity to grow and create a wider organization and a role for them. There are 4 areas very clearly we see there is a just ending the poll. Yeah. So there are 4 very clearly the barriers which we identified based on our research interactions. We are saying one is a silo view. And silo view here means that you look at only one kind of a view. So for example, taking example, when you're processing and you've taken a interesting 3 dimensions based again on a lot of inputs and expertise which came from a lot of interactions from the business services leaders. There are 3 critical dimensions where this kind of silo view is taken. There could be many dimensions, and sometimes there could be a view about, okay, why not a multiple view than a silo view and so on and so forth. But we wanted to look at primarily 3 critical dimensions where they are the barriers in terms of the silo view. One is looking at a process and a function. There are a lot of functional guys, which are like typically a finance qualified accountants moving from a functional role to the shared services role. They look at everything as a functional or accounting areas. They don't look at the process, underlying process for that specific functional item. So I'm just taking a simple example. Accounts payable is a process, and there are a lot of functional element which is also happening underneath. For example, an accounting which will happen. So once you process a 3-way match or an invoice punching or invoice processing, after doing the processing, it hits an account, and there's an accounting which happens. So this connect of this function and a process, sometimes they misses. A lot of time the business services guys, the shared services guys, they will get lost into these processes, right? They only look at the process and they're not worried about, or they're not bothered about what's happening in terms of the accounting or the function and how it is connected. So process and function, the business process and function is something which has to be seen as a dual focus. That's why we're giving a silo view and a dual focus both together. The top is the barriers, the bottoms are the opportunity, how to fight with those barriers and really go beyond that. So dual focus you need to have in terms of business process and function. Similar kind of a dual focus you need to have is on a process or a technology. Many times you'll be hearing people saying, I want to do a new age technology, right? And I want to bring a new solutions and so on and so forth. While what you can do is you can just look at a process fixes, a process improvement, a process redesign, which will solve it. And if you don't do it, you will be applying a excellent solution or technology on a top of a broken processes. And that's where you'll find, or either way, vice versa. Sometimes only looking at process and not looking at what could be solved by technology. So silo views has to be looked at from a dual focus. And always we talk about focus is all about one thing. Here we're talking about dual focus. It's a simultaneous focus on couple of 3 dimensions, very important dimension. Customer and team is another one is important. But if I could really pick 2, which becomes very, very critical from a silo view perspective is, and it's a big challenge for the finance leaders in the shared services space is business process and function, both seen together, and process and technology, both seen together. And there are multiple examples we can share. In the interest of the time, we're just trying to run through of some of these, and we are very happy to have some questions later offline as well. The second one is a narrow activity focus, and I'm sure you'll have a question by saying, what is the difference in a silo view and a narrow activity focus? It's also about looking at what I am doing. The difference in silo view is you're taking one view, which is process or a function view. Narrow activities, I'm just taking my view, which is my box. I do this process, I receive an input, I do process, and I release an output. So you look at typically what we call IPO view, input, process, output. You look at input. Sometimes many people don't even look at input. They say it's my process. I was not sent this document, so I have not processed it. We talk about typically a watermelon effect where the SLAs are green, but the business owners are unhappy about it because you will have a lot of SLAs, which are my SLAs, my work, etc., etc., where the intent to really break that barrier from an opportunity point is to connect with the big picture. And how to do that is to look at end to end. And sometimes we give a interesting acronym for it to say IPOO, which is IIPOO, which is you look at the initiation, which is one step before the input, and then look at what's the input, what's the process, what's the output, and what's the outcome of that output. So you look at if that kind of a connect, that really makes a difference. So look at the process chain, the upstream and downstream. How it is really going to impact your transaction which you're processing, how it is going to impact. And it is not only for transaction processing, it is true even, for example, MIS and reporting sometimes seem to be a high-end work. And Anand, you gave example. That sometimes becomes so transactional because you're only looking, I have to process this MIS, I have to publish this MIS. Versus saying how this is being used by the users is a narrow activity focus, if I can say. The third barrier is lost in transactions. People are looking at number of transactions they process, the volume metrics typically as we call it, versus the service metrics and business metrics. Number of invoices you have processed versus how much time you took to process is a service metric, and how well you processed on time from the payment point of view, the paid on time, is another example which is important. So how you start looking at finally the business metrics, which enables the business guys to either negotiate better with the procurement, or similarly looking at DSO. Just looking at by saying, I got the bill and I have raised it, versus by saying, how well I was able to reduce the DSO is important. So don't get lost into the transaction, but look at transactions and apply that analytical thinking to look at those metrics, both the service as well as the business metrics, which is very important. The fourth dimension we are finding is sometimes there are a lot of senior guys. When I say senior guys, they have been into the functional roles. They have been playing typically a finance controller role or roles like that, and then they are given this opportunity to be part of shared services. Somewhere they have a little bit of a mindset, if I can say, by saying, oh, I know how it works, or I have done it in the business. When it comes to shared services, it requires to connect with multiple dimensions like business, customer, etc., as we're talking about. And hence it becomes very important to bring that learnability mindset, open for that change from the curiosity point of view, looking at how to unlearn something, learn and relearn, if I can say. I think that becomes an important, another opportunity to respond to the barriers is very, very, very important dimension. Just interest of the time is moving to the next page, Sanjay. Before I just go there, I just also want to share the results of the poll. If I can just quickly say how people have thought of on this poll, please. Yeah. If you can see the results of this barrier point of view, there is an interesting mix of the responses. We can see we are seeing a lot of adoption of a new age technology seems to be one of the most common barrier coming out of the this poll. And I think this is true in terms of their ability to visualize, looking at multiple technology solutions like analytical tools, the cloud, looking at blockchains and those kind of areas. How to use that, how to embrace it is something which is important. And the next one obviously is getting lost in transactions. I think is very, very true. Just a quick minute in terms of saying the kind of the life which is changing, or the opportunity which is available in the finance shared services for the finance professionals is, there are a variety of roles which is possible. It could be just progressing in the same line function, as we call it, like a process or an operations role, or moving into the roles like project and program management role, where you can be part of driving transformation, leading those change programs, and so on and so forth. It could be just moving back to typical functional role, looking at, becoming, if I can say, domain experts or for SMEs or finance function in the shared services, bringing the higher value analytical stuff and so on and so forth. Taking lead, we have seen a lot of finance professionals becoming a business technologist or even becoming a CIO of an organization. Actually, I've been dealing with a couple of CIOs these days who are a chartered accountant, and they were the finance professionals in their earlier careers, because it's all about bringing that aptitude to drive that kind of a change, and they have progressed into that kind of a lateral and then going upward in their career. And obviously, the last but not least is really taking that overall leadership from the business services point of view, which is multifunction, multi-geography. It could be even multiple structuring. It could be a combination of captive and outsourcing, etc., etc. So finance professionals has a lot of opportunity from the career progression and the roles point of view. And there are many things which is offered by the shared services industry to them. Just next page, Sanjay. This is the finally what we are saying is the traits which a finance professional needs to have to really go across these barriers, grab this opportunity, and so on and so forth. And we have given an acronym called TRACK, and TRACK. And this TRACK are the 5 traits which makes them really the strategic partner and really become a true business partner. There are a lot of capability indicators, and you'll find a lot of this data available. Once these reports will be released to you today, you can always go through in more details and get back with more questions. But just to share with you very briefly about the TRACK, one thing very important in the TRACK, the T is track business, think business, think customer. And you need to have that bend of mind to think about the business and business as customer. That's where you start getting more strategic connect. It's again what Narayan was saying in the beginning. It's about a mindset change. It's about a behavioral mindset change. By saying I have to think beyond me and not just think about one journey or a stretch of a journey of a customer. Looking at the multiple touch points connecting to the entire journey, which becomes an important element from the think business and think customer point of view. R is readiness and capability to lead change. Two elements to this. I think there are 3 kinds of change we talk about: the change readiness, change management, and leading the change, if I can say. Leading the change is very important, but at the same point of time, questioning the status quo and self-readiness to go and drive that and lead that change is important, and not limit yourself to change management. These are all about individual traits which you need to have to become a strategic partner and grow up the ladder. Accountability of organizational goals, which is A, it is not about what I have to do. It is about also looking at and connecting the big picture, the organizational goals, and saying how much of that I can do as my accountability, and I can contribute towards achieving that organizational goals becomes an important area from accountability standpoint. The C stands for cost and value focus. Obviously, we would look at a lot of analytical ways of looking at cost benchmarking. What is my full loaded cost today? How can I optimize it? What is the business impact, P&L impact, etc. I can drive, and so on and so forth. I think we spoke just a few minutes back. Because very, very important dimension. How you keep challenging your own cost, and how can you continuously focus on the value which you deliver to the business. Last but not least, again, the K is knowledge beyond role. So not just limiting to the current role which you perform, but build domain knowledge. If you're in manufacturing, within the manufacturing. If you're in a pharma, look at pharma. Within the pharma, you are in generics. If you're in API, try to get more understanding of the business domain, much beyond just the processing information. I think that connect is very, very important. And also going beyond that to people management, looking at technology side of it to finally deliver the excellence. I think that quickly gives you 5, if I can say, trick and track to have those traits to deliver on it. I know I'm running very late on my schedule now on the time, but I'd still like to take one question, and I will request Narayan if you can very briefly respond to it. One of the things which, and Sanjay, if you can just take the slides off. Yeah. So Narayan, a quick question to you is, a lot of things we spoke from the finance and finance leaders' point of view. One of the areas we wanted to hear your views, how you are seeing that, this barrier which came out also from the poll, that the barriers of adoption of new technology or newest technology. What do you think is the reasons or why finance professionals are not able to really move up and embrace some of these newest technology, available like cloud? And if you don't have an understanding of cloud, you talk about the RPAs and AIs and cognitive, this all will become good terminologies if you don't understand the basics like some of these or many of other areas. So how do you think, what is that stopping them to really cross that barrier and adopt or embrace the newest technologies?
Okay. Thanks, Rakesh. So I'll take that in a second. So first of all, thank you also to you and Sanjay for some very interesting comments. And probably I'll just respond very quickly also to something Sanjay said earlier. Perhaps I wasn't entirely clear in my comments, but I don't think I'm suggesting that historical data is not important. It is the only thing that we have to work on. But I guess what I was trying to get at was that historical financial data is not the only kind of data. And I think we need to be open to looking at broader sets of data as well when we think about the look ahead view. But in terms of your question, Rakesh, I think that's a really important question, and which has come through in this poll as well. So I think there's a few different things at play. One is that there isn't enough of an understanding of the size of the prize. There is really I have seen examples where people migrate to the cloud, but then they still do, some kind of quarterly reporting or some kind of, they use it for some half monthly or quarterly periodic reporting and to pull out some information. They don't really understand that with the cloud, you have the possibility of real-time engagement with the data. And you can get much more of a flexible view of what the data is telling you over time. And you can scale up and scale down in a very, very efficient way. Also, you can, from a cost point of view, not have to pay upfront in terms of capital expenditure. It's a license fee-based model. So it's operating expenditure for your organization. And often, when they look into it, they find that there are some really good arguments that they need to be considering. The other thing also is there can sometimes be a fear that you're giving your data to a third party in some way. And actually, if you have an on-prem system, an on-premises system, it's somehow more secure. And that's a bit of a fallacy, especially in the world where tools like Microsoft, Azure or AWS have become quite sophisticated in terms of the basic security infrastructure that they provide for most kinds of organizations. I mean, if you're a government department and you have some defense and national security sensitive data, that's a different thing. But if you're a standard organization which is looking for a reasonable level of protection, I think most cloud solutions, the mainstream big ones, can provide a certain amount of security on that front. So to your question, I think some of it is just perhaps not enough appreciation of the size of the prize, exaggeration of the risk, and also I think a certain element of just waiting. Sometimes there's a tendency to just wait until you feel that I have to do it now or everybody else is doing it. I mean, one of the things we've seen in COVID, we ran a global survey, and one of the things we've seen is that small and medium accounting practices and small and medium enterprises have ramped up their adoption of cloud globally when we looked, including, and the results were similar for India, ramped up their adoption of cloud in the first few weeks after COVID. Now, why is that? That's because when they couldn't come into the office for effective document sharing, they realized the only way to do it is through the cloud. So they were forced to adapt. And when they were forced to adopt and adapt, they did it. So some of it is also just a mixture of inadequate understanding, but also just the push to do it.
Yeah, no, thanks. Absolutely. It's a good point. And absolutely completely agree. Sanjay, any closing comments from you before we jump to the next panel of the CFOs? I have a couple of people really waiting for me.
Yeah. So while Narayanan was making that comment, one thought came to my mind. I think the finance professionals, by and large, are also a bit risk averse. So, adapting to technologies, see, finance people are at the core not technology experts. So at times when this newfangled kind of things come through, people get really worried about, because control freaks, they're control freaks anyway. So if something comes up which they don't fully understand and control, they get a little scared of it. But I think fundamentally what you're saying is right. And the time now for, being that scared is over. And I think we're all set to go great. And COVID, unfortunately, is a disaster to society as a whole, but at least to some services like finance services, etc., it can actually speeden things up really rapidly from a development point of view. So thank you very much to both of you. Rakesh, back to you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Sanjay. I think it was, thanks for that comment and fantastic hearing all of you today. Obviously, we just ran a little against the time. We would have loved to have more deliberation on this session. I know a couple of questions also came in. Maybe we can just try to just take those questions offline, and we will get back to some of you over an email, and we'll try to coordinate on the panelists and then respond to those questions. We will also be sharing the link of the report which we shared just now. And I'll talk about how the modalities, etc., in a little while as we progress with the next panel. So just taking this opportunity to thank you, Sanjay, for a great time and insight. Sanjay, thank you. Narayanan, thanks for taking this time out in morning of yours.
My pleasure.
Joining and sharing your insight was fantastic. And I'm already receiving comments from the people saying that it was very nice to hear from you. And thank you, Rahul, for, as always, a great collaborator and a partner to whatever SSF does. Nice to hear.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
With